Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, the three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we focus on one essential component of the epistemic firewall. In this part 5, we cover the firewall function of metagamma. This is the highest guardian of the system. It is not about the rules of the world, but about the rules for discovering and certifying those rules. The skill you will gain is the ability to audit the scientific process itself, to distinguish between a validated law of nature and a persuasive story that has merely dressed itself in the clothing of evidence. Our core question is, how do we validate the process by which grammars are proposed and certified? This is the deepest layer of the firewall. Without it, we have no way to know if a proposed constraint, a grammar G, is a genuine discovery or an elaborate fiction. Metagrammar is the rule set governing rule discovery. It defines what counts as evidence, what tests must be passed, what independence must be shown, and how failure is handled. Metagrammar is what prevents physics from becoming mythology. Let me state the audio equation that captures its essence. We say, a rule is not admitted because it fits. It is admitted when it survives a validation operator V. We write this as V of G, given data, windows, and pipelines, equals PES. That is, V of G by data, windows, pipelines equals PES. The symbol V is the validation operator. It is a formal procedure, a checklist, an audit protocol that a candidate grammar G must pass before it can be granted a license. This is the metagrammatical gatekeeper. Now, why is this necessary? The failure mode it prevents is the most subtle and dangerous: inferential collapse into narrative. The human mind is a master pattern recognizer and storyteller. Given a set of data points, a pile of phi sentences, we can invent an infinite number of grammars G that fit or explain them. We can add hidden variables, adjustable parameters, epicycles, and elegant complexities to make any story match the existing facts. Without a strict metagrammar to govern validation, we would slowly replace the tough, objective constraints of reality with a comforting, self-referential narrative that feels true because it is consistent, not because it is constrained by the world. Metagrammar is the immune system against this intellectual decay. To understand this, let's begin with a clarifying analogy, one that touches a deep structure of Afghan life: the process of authenticating a priceless antique carpet. Imagine you are presented with a magnificent carpet, said to be from a specific master weaver in Herat from a century ago. The carpet itself is the proposed grammar G, a beautiful, complex pattern that seems to tell a story. How do you validate it? You do not simply admire its beauty or its convincing appearance. You invoke a metagrammar, a rule set for authentication. This rule set includes examining the knots per square inch under magnification, a specific quantitative test. Analyzing the dye composition to see if it uses only natural pigments available at that time, an independence check from modern methods. Comparing the pattern motifs to known, verified examples from that era and region, a consistency test across different windows of evidence, and looking for the subtle signs of hand-weaving versus machine replication, a test of the proposed origin story. If the carpet passes this entire validation protocol V, it is certified as authentic. If it fails any step, it is downgraded to a reproduction or a fantasy piece, no matter how beautiful it is. The metagrammar of authentication is what protects the integrity of the tradition from forgery. In science, the forgery is the fake rule, the narrative that looks like law. In Holophase terms, the carpet is a candidate grammar G, a proposed constraint on phi patterns. The validation operator V is the metagrammatical protocol. It does not ask if G is beautiful or intuitive. It asks if G has passed a battery of specific, rigorous tests that are designed to expose narrative forgery. Now, what is the Fallman meaning of metagrammar in Holophase terms? Since everything is phi and its derivatives, and grammar G is a constraint on these, metagrammar must be a constraint on the process of proposing and testing G. Crucially, this process must involve the triunity. A metagrammar requires that a proposed law survive tests across different regimes of time, omega, space, k, and motion, v. You cannot validate a grammar using only slow time, low omega, experiments, and then claim it governs all timescales. You cannot validate it only at human scales, a specific k regime, and claim it governs the quantum or cosmic. You cannot validate it only for slow motions, low v, and claim it holds at relativistic speeds. True validation under metagrammar demands evidence that spans multiple omega, k, v regimes. This is because a real constraint of reality is universal across the echoes. A narrative invented to fit one regime will typically fray when stretched to another. Let's formalize the validation operator V. V takes as input 1. The candidate grammar G. 2. The corpus of licensed phi sentences, the data. 3. The specifications of the windows W in which those sentences were reconstructed. 4. A full description of the reconstruction pipelines used, including their assumptions and declared uncertainties. V then performs a sequence of checks. These checks are the core of metagrammar. Let's list them plainly. Check 1. Independence of evidence. The sentences used to support G must come from independent pipelines, instruments, or observational methods. If all your evidence comes from one type of sensor using one reconstruction algorithm, you have not validated G. You have validated the idiosyncrasies of your toolchain. Independence breaks the circle of self-confirmation. Check 2. Perturbation stability, as defined in Part 4. V must verify that G was tested not just on existing sentences, but on new sentences generated by deliberately perturbing the system. Did the grammar predict the stability of the omega-kv relations under those perturbations? Check 3. Scope spanning. V audits whether the evidence spans multiple scales of omega, k, and v. Has G been tested with high-frequency and low-frequency phenomena, omega regimes? At large and small spatial scales, k regimes? For slow and fast propagation speeds, v regimes? A grammar that only works in one corner of the omega-kv space gets a narrow license. Check 4. Predictive novelty. This is critical. Did G predict the existence of a new class of phi sentences before they were measured? A narrative can always be adjusted to explain existing data. A real law often predicts a new relationship that is then found. V checks the historical record of prediction versus post-diction. Check 5. Parsimony and diagnostic tally. Here we bring in the concept of energy as accounting. Validation has a cost. In metagrammar, we call this the diagnostic tally. It is a measure of the complexity, the special pleading, the auxiliary assumptions, and the patches required to keep G consistent with all the sentences. A true constraint tends to have a diagnostic tally that decreases or stabilizes as evidence grows. The rule becomes simpler, more elegant, as it is tested across wider domains. A fake rule, a narrative, has a rising diagnostic tally, a growing maintenance debt. Every new surprising sentence requires a new exception, a new hidden variable, a new adjustment to the story. The ledger of explanations becomes bloated and strained. Think of the diagnostic tally like the maintenance log of an old caravanserai on the Silk Road in Afghanistan. A well-built, sound structure, a true grammar, requires routine maintenance, but the log shows consistent, predictable repairs. A poorly built or fundamentally flawed structure, a narrative grammar, shows a different log. A leaking roof one season, a cracking wall the next, a sinking foundation the season after that. Each repair is a new ad hoc fix. The cost and complexity of maintenance rises over time. The wise caravan master, looking at the log, doesn't just see the current repair bill, he sees the trajectory. A rising diagnostic tally is a metagrammatical red flag. It signals that the proposed law is fighting reality, not describing it. Now the operational interpretation. How does metagrammar appear in the daily work of science? It appears as protocols, standards, and review criteria. The requirement for double-blind trials in medicine is a metagrammatical rule. The requirement in physics for an experiment to be replicated by an independent group using different apparatus is a metagrammatical rule. The peer review question, what would falsify your theory, is a metagrammatical demand. These are all instantiations of the validation operator V. They are not about the content of the theory, they are about the process of its justification. The firewall role of metagrammar is to block the ultimate epistemic failure, the institutionalization of mythology. It prevents a situation where a community, through sheer consensus, elegance, or tradition, agrees on a set of rules that have not passed rigorous validation. History is littered with examples. The crystalline spheres, the phlogiston theory, the luminiferous ether. These were elegant, consensus-driven narratives that explained the data of their time. They were not invalidated by philosophy. They were invalidated by the metagrammatical principle that a rule must survive tests across new omega KV regimes, like high-speed motion for the ether, and that its diagnostic tally must not explode with new evidence. Let's state clearly what assumptions are allowed and forbidden by this firewall mechanism. Allowed. You may propose any candidate grammar G, no matter how strange. You may use existing data to motivate it. You are allowed, even encouraged, to be creative. You may not certify or license G as a law of nature until it has passed the validation operator V. You may not dismiss failed predictions or contradictory sentences without a rigorous, metagrammatically sound audit of the windows and uncertainties. You may not replace validation with appeals to authority, mathematical beauty, or historical precedent. What happens when the check fails? When a proposed grammar fails validation, when VG does not return pass, the firewall does not reject the grammar outright. It triggers an escalation ladder of license consequences. We will detail this shortly. Now, we must state the explicit prediction and falsification for the concept of metagrammar itself. This is subtle but essential. Prediction of a true constraint under metagrammatical scrutiny. A true constraint, a real grammar G, will become simpler and more robust under broader validation. As it is tested across wider omega KV regimes, its core formulation will remain stable. its required auxiliary assumptions, its diagnostic tally, will shrink or remain constant, and its predictive power will increase. The relationship between omega, k, and v it describes will hold with greater precision and across more diverse systems. This is the metagrammatical prediction about real laws. They consolidate, they do not fragment. Falsification of a proposed rule's validity. If a rule needs continual exceptions, special case patches, and ad hoc adjustments to survive new evidence from different omega kv regimes, it is not a law, it is a narrative. The metagrammatical falsification condition is an ever-rising diagnostic tally. When the maintenance debt of a theory grows without bound, when each new experiment requires a new parameter, a new field, a new dimension, or a new epicycle to explain it, the metagrammar flags the theory as failing validation. It is being sustained by intellectual debt, not by empirical asset. A powerful historical example is the Ptolemaic model of planetary motion. It fit the existing data, the sentences, beautifully. But as observational precision improved, new windows with smaller uncertainty delta, the model's diagnostic tally skyrocketed. More and more epicycles were needed to save the phenomena. The metagrammatical falsifier was not a single contradictory observation, but the explosive complexity debt of the theory. In contrast, the Copernican Keplerian grammar, while initially less accurate with the old data, had a low and stable diagnostic tally. It predicted new relationships, like the phases of Venus, that were later confirmed. It simplified under broader validation. That is the signature of truth. Now, let's connect this to the triunity explicitly. The validation operator V must test across omega, k, and v regimes. What does this mean operationally? Timescale tests. Does the grammar hold for processes that are extremely fast, high omega, like particle decays, and extremely slow, low omega, like continental drift? A grammar of mechanics that only works for medium-speed objects fails the omega regime test. Space-scale tests. Does the grammar hold for the very large, cosmic scales, low spatial frequency k, and the very small, quantum scales, high spatial frequency k? A theory of gravity that fails at small scales fails the k regime test. Motion regime tests. Does the grammar hold for motions that are a tiny fraction of light speed and for motions approaching light speed? A theory of electromagnetism that only works for stationary charges fails the V regime test. A grammar that aspires to be fundamental must eventually face these tests. Metagrammar is the protocol that insists on it. Now, the license consequence escalation ladder. This is the structured response when validation fails or weakens. It is not a single action, but a progressive series, moving from mild correction to total rejection. Recalibration. The first step. Perhaps the uncertainties delta in the falsifying sentences were underestimated, or the reconstruction pipeline had a minor bug. Recalibration means rechecking the measurements and the data processing. It is a technical adjustment. Assumption audit. If recalibration doesn't resolve the issue, we audit the hidden assumptions in the grammar G itself and in the validation attempt. Did we assume a perfectly isolated system? Did we neglect a small coupling? We make these assumptions explicit and test them. 3. Scope narrowing. If the grammar consistently fails in a new omega kv regime, we formally narrow its license. We say, this grammar G is valid for mechanical systems at speeds much less than light, Vc, and we revoke its claim to universal validity. This is not a failure of science, it is a success of precision. Most of engineering operates on such locally licensed grammars. 4. Family rejection. If the grammar fails even in its core, previously validated domain upon re-audit with better tools, or if its diagnostic tally has grown so large that the theory is a patchwork of exceptions, the entire family of theories based on its core premise is rejected. It is retired from active duty and moved to the history of ideas. This is what happened to the caloric theory of heat or the vital force theory of life. This escalation ladder is the metagrammatical procedure for managing failure. It replaces crisis and revolution with disciplined, granular adjustment. It is the firewall's administrative engine. Let's now explore the concept of the diagnostic tally, the maintenance debt, in more detail, as it is a key metagrammatical tool. In holophase accounting, energy is a tally of omega k v coherence. The diagnostic tally is one level up. It is a tally of the coherence of the explanation itself. Every time you add a free parameter to G to fit new data, the tally increases. Every time you introduce a new entity not reducible to phi patterns, the tally increases sharply. Every time you say except when or under these special conditions, the tally increases. A healthy, validated theory pays down this debt over time by showing how the new data actually simplifies the understanding, by revealing a deeper unity that eliminates parameters and exceptions. I will use an analogy from the intricate social grammar of an Afghan jirga, or council. The purpose is to resolve a dispute and restore social coherence. A wise resolution, a true grammar, is one that addresses the root cause. It may be complex at first, but as it is applied to similar disputes over time, its core principles become clearer and more widely accepted. The diagnostic tally of the Council's wisdom is low. Few new exceptions or special rulings are needed. A poor resolution, a narrative grammar, is one that merely papers over the immediate conflict with a temporary ad hoc fix. It does not address the underlying pattern. Soon, a nearly identical dispute arises, requiring another special ruling, then another. The Council's ledger of rulings becomes a tangled web of contradictions and special cases. The maintenance debt of their governance rises. The metagrammatical insight is that the rising complexity of the ruling itself is evidence that they have not found the true constraint, the real principle that governs the social system. They are managing symptoms, not laws. In physics, the shift from Newtonian gravity to Einstein's general relativity followed this pattern. Newton's grammar had a persistent, small diagnostic tally. The precession of Mercury's orbit was a tiny, unexplained exception. For centuries, it was treated as a minor anomaly, a possible calibration error. But as measurement precision grew, the anomaly remained. The maintenance debt, though small, was real and would not go away. Einstein's new grammar not only explained all the old sentences, but also predicted new ones: light bending, time dilation. Crucially, it did so with a simpler foundational premise: geometry of spacetime versus action at a distance force, and eliminated the anomalous precession exception. The diagnostic tally was reduced. This is a metagrammatical signature of progress. Now we must state the mandatory episode 11 axioms, now applied at this highest level. Rules do not become real by elegance, consensus, or tradition. They earn a license only by surviving falsification, variation, independence, and scope discipline. Metagrammar is the explicit implementation of this axiom. It is the engineered system that ensures survival is tested through falsification attempts, perturbation, variation across omega k/v regimes, independence of evidence, and scope discipline, the escalation ladder. And when a rule fails, we do not believe harder. We tighten, downgrade, or retire its license. The escalation ladder is the operational manual for this axiom. The skill you gain from this part is metacognitive auditing. You learn to look past the content of a scientific claim and audit the process that led to its certification. You ask metagrammatical questions. What is the validation pedigree VG for this rule? Across what omega KV regimes has it been tested? What is its diagnostic tally? Is it stable or rising? What is on its escalation ladder? Has it undergone scope narrowing? This skill protects you from being swept up in scientific fads or entrenched dogmas. It allows you to evaluate claims based on the robustness of their justification, not their popularity. Let's now address a profound implication. Metagrammar itself must be subject to its own discipline. How do we validate the validation operator V? This leads to a regress, but a meaningful one. The validation of metagrammar is pragmatic and historical. Does the application of V over time produce a body of knowledge that is stable, predictive, and increasingly unified? Does it filter out theories that later prove to be dead ends? The ultimate test of a metagrammar is the health of the science it governs. This is why episode 11 is an exercise in epistemic engineering. We are designing a firewall whose success is measured by the sanity and progress of the science it protects. We now return to the core ontology. Everything is phi. Therefore, any grammar G is a constraint on phi patterns. The metagrammatical validation must, in the end, check this ontological commitment. Does G introduce new fundamental primitives? If it does, it receives a heavy penalty in its diagnostic tally. The goal is always to express the constraint in terms of phi and its derivatives. This ontological parsimony is part of the validation. Finally, let's summarize the epistemic function of this part as required. We have defined metagrammar as the rule set governing rule discovery and certification. It is implemented through a validation operator, VG data windows pipelines equals pass. It demands tests across omega, K, and V regimes. It uses the concept of a diagnostic tally, maintenance debt, to distinguish robust laws from fragile narratives. The explicit prediction is that true constraints simplify under broader validation. Fewer patches, stable tally. The explicit falsification condition is an ever-rising diagnostic tally. The need for continual exceptions and special pleading to fit new data. License consequences follow an escalation ladder: recalibration, assumption audit, scope narrowing, family rejection. This strengthens the firewall by providing the ultimate safeguard against the human tendency to substitute story for structure. It ensures that the process of science is as objective and disciplined as the reality it seeks to describe. It makes the method itself subject to method. If you want to see the full mathematical derivations and exact equations behind this idea, you can search for Holophase on Zenodo. There you will find the scientific papers that this audio journey is built on. Carry this highest skill forward. When you encounter a grand scientific claim, do not just look at the claim. Audit its validation. Ask for its V, its omega KV regime coverage, its diagnostic tally history. This is how you help keep science sane. Now we bridge to the next step. With metagrammar in place as the guardian of process, we must finally turn to the actual classification of constraints. What kinds of grammars are there? The first and most fundamental class is not physical but logical. To run a firewall, we must classify constraints. First, logic. Salam and peace be upon you.